It wasn't guilt I saw in his eyes when I asked him about the property transfer. It was something colder, something calculated. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer in Ottawa, mostly on government contracts, the kind of work that requires patience and precision and an ability to read what's underneath the surface before it becomes a problem. I retired 3 years ago with a reasonable pension, a house in Manotick that my wife Doris and I had paid off completely, and a cabin near Calabogie that had been in my family since my father built it by hand in 1971. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable, and everything I had, I'd earned slowly and carefully. My daughter Isabel was the kind of person who made every room a little warmer. She had her mother's laugh and her grandfather's stubbornness, which I mean as a compliment. She was 31, worked as a school occupational therapist in Canada, and she had spent most of her adult life building things quietly the way I'd taught her to. Not loud, not rushed, just steady. She met him at a friend's wedding in Gatineau the summer before last. His name was Tristan. He was 36, originally from somewhere near Trois-Rivières, and he worked in what he called private wealth consulting, which as far as I could ever tell meant he advised people with money on how to protect it from taxes and family members who might otherwise get too close to it. The irony of that was not lost on me later. When Isabel first brought him home for Thanksgiving, I shook his hand and told myself I was being too cautious. He was polished, not in a fake way, or at least not in a way I could pin down immediately. He knew which fork to use. He remembered the names of Isabel's childhood friends when she mentioned them in passing. He helped clear the plates without being asked. He called me sir the first time, and then shifted to my first name, Hugh, only after I offered it, which is exactly how you're supposed to do that. Doris loved him almost immediately. She told me that night in the kitchen that he was the first man Isabel had brought home who seemed like he was paying attention. I nodded. I said yes, he seems good, and I meant it at the time. The engagement happened 6 months later, around Christmas. He proposed at the Rideau Club during a dinner he'd arranged himself with Isabel's favorite flowers, white ranunculus, which he'd had to order specially in December, and a ring that was simple and elegant in the way she would have chosen herself. She called me that night, crying the good kind of crying, and I sat in my armchair listening to her voice and felt something open up in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. The wedding was set for the following October. They found a venue outside of Perth, an old limestone farm property converted for events, the kind of place that looks like it was built specifically to appear timeless in photographs. The planning took over the spring and summer. Isabel handled most of it herself, with Doris helping on weekends. Tristan contributed ideas and money and an opinion on almost everything, which didn't bother me. Men my age who complain about grooms having opinions tend to be the same ones who complain about everything else. I noticed the first thing in July. We were sitting on the back porch of my house in Manotick, me, Tristan, and Isabel, on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of slow summer afternoon where conversations drift naturally from subject to subject. We'd been talking about the cabin at Calabogie. Isabel mentioned wanting to take Tristan up for a long weekend before the summer ended, and he lit up in a way that seemed genuine. He asked about the property. How many acres? Whether there was lake access? Whether the road in was passable in winter? Normal questions. Curious questions. The kind any person might ask. But then he asked whether I'd ever had it formally appraised. I said I hadn't, not recently. My father had left it to me without a lot of paperwork. We'd done a basic title transfer through a notary in Renfrew County when he passed, and that had been enough. Tristan nodded. He said something about how property values in that corridor had increased significantly in the last decade, that it might be worth knowing what I actually had. He said it the way you say something that sounds helpful when you're covering for the fact that you needed to know the answer for reasons of your own. I didn't say anything. I filed it. In August, he mentioned the cabin twice more. Once while we were helping Isabel move some boxes to a storage unit. A passing comment about how much she loved it up there, how it must be meaningful to know it would stay in the family. Once at dinner, when he asked if I'd ever thought about adding her name to the title before the wedding, just to simplify things down the road. I said I'd think about it. That night I lay awake for a while. Doris was asleep beside me. The ceiling was the same ceiling I'd stared at for years. when something was bothering me and I couldn't name it yet. I thought about what it would mean for a man who worked in wealth management to ask those particular questions in that particular order. I thought about whether I was being a suspicious old fool. I decided I was probably being a suspicious old fool. Then September came, and with it the rehearsal dinner. We held it at a restaurant in the Glebe, a long table in a private room in the back, about 20 people, both families together for the first time in any real way. Tristan's parents had driven down from Trois-Rivières. His father was a quiet man who spent most of the evening looking at his phone. His mother was charming and warm and talked at length about a property dispute she'd had with the neighbor that had taken 3 years to resolve and had ultimately gone in her favor. She told the story with the particular satisfaction of someone who won, not because they were right, but because they had more stamina. I sat next to Tristan's father for part of the evening. We talked about hockey, about the drive down, about retirement. He told me he'd sold his contracting business 8 years ago and had been living well since. He asked me what I'd done. I told him. He nodded and said, "Lot of equity in that kind of career. Government work, steady pension, probably property?" I said yes. He nodded again, just nodded, and I thought, I wonder how much his son has told him about me. The next morning was the wedding. Isabel had spent the night at our house in Manotick. She'd wanted to wake up in her childhood home on the morning she got married, which made Doris cry happy tears the night before and somewhat complicated tears the morning of. I knocked on her door at 8 o'clock with a cup of tea, the way I'd done on every important morning of her life going back to her first day of school. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed in her robe, holding her phone, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was about 12 years old and had broken something she knew I would be upset about. Not guilt exactly, more like the look of someone carrying something they're not sure they should be carrying alone. I set the tea down on her nightstand. I asked if she was okay. She said she was just nervous, wedding nerves. She smiled and it reached her eyes, but just barely. I left her to get ready. The ceremony was at 2 o'clock. The venue looked the way those old limestone properties always look in October. The maples along the laneway had gone full orange, and the sky was that particular flat gray that makes color look richer by comparison. Doris cried before we even got inside. I drove and didn't say much. I was doing what I'd spent 30 years doing at work, observing a structure, looking for stress points, deciding whether what I was seeing was normal load-bearing or something that was about to give. We danced. That's what they call it when a father dances with his daughter at her wedding, the father-daughter dance. We'd chosen a song Isabel had loved since she was young, something her mother used to play in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. She leaned into me the way she used to when she was small, and I held her the way you hold something you know you're about to let go of in the best possible way. Halfway through the song, she reached into the small fold of fabric at her waist. Her dress had a hidden pocket, which she'd been pleased about, and she pressed a folded piece of paper into my jacket breast pocket. She did it with her hand flat against my chest, the way you'd smooth down a lapel, quietly, without looking up. I kept dancing. I didn't reach for the paper. When the song ended, she kissed my cheek and went back to Tristan, and the rest of the room resumed its evening. I stood at the edge of the dance floor for a moment, and then walked to the coat room, closed the door behind me, and unfolded the paper. It was written in her handwriting, small and careful, the same handwriting she'd had since grade 4. "Dad, don't sign anything tonight. I'll explain everything tomorrow. I love you. I'm okay. Please don't react." I stood in that coat room for what felt like a very long time. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what I didn't know. I thought about the appraisal question in July, the title question in August, Tristan's father asking about my equity, his mother winning a property dispute through stamina. I folded the note back up and put it in my jacket pocket. I went back to the reception. I had a glass of wine. I shook hands and accepted congratulations, and watched my daughter dance with her new husband. And I looked at his face while he looked at her, and I tried to see what was underneath. It was a pleasant face. That was the problem. It was a very pleasant, very composed face. I found a reason to speak to Tristan alone near the end of the evening. We ended up near the bar at the same moment, the way things happen at weddings. He clapped me on the shoulder. He said it had been a perfect day. He said he was the luckiest man he knew. I looked at him. I smiled. I said, "You know, I've been meaning to ask you, did you have a notary in mind for the property documents? Or were you going to use the same one we used for the title transfer on the cabin?" There was a pause, very short. The kind you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it. He said he didn't think there were any property documents to deal with, not right now. I said, of course. I must have misremembered a conversation. I said, "Congratulations again," and moved away. His face had gone just slightly still for that half second. Not guilty. Careful. I drove home that night, knowing I wasn't going to sleep. I called my own solicitor the next morning. Her name is Teresa Bouchard. She'd handled my father's estate and had done the title work on both properties. I told her I needed her to look at something before I did anything else. I told her to check whether any documentation had been filed or was in preparation regarding my properties, the Manotick House or the Calabogie cabin, that I hadn't personally authorized. I told her to check whether anyone had requested copies of my title documents, my identification records, or any financial instruments connected to my name. She called me back that afternoon. Someone had contacted the land registry in Renfrew County 3 weeks earlier, she told me. Not a formal filing, an inquiry, requesting confirmation of the registered owner of the Calabogie property, the lot dimensions, and whether any co-ownership was currently registered. The inquiry had been filed by a wealth management firm based in Gatineau. Tristan's firm. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "What would that kind of inquiry typically precede?" Theresa said it could be benign, due diligence for estate planning, for example, but it could also precede a request for a spousal interest declaration, or an application to be added to a title as a co-owner following a marriage. She asked if I wanted her to put a notation on both titles, a flag, essentially, so that any further activity would require my direct written authorization, confirmed through her office, before it could proceed. I said yes. I said, "Do it today." Then I called Isabel. She came over that afternoon, alone. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of tea, and told me what she'd been carrying for the past 2 months. She'd found documents on his laptop in August. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for a restaurant reservation confirmation he'd said he'd forwarded her. She'd seen a folder labeled with her name and mine. Inside was a spreadsheet. It listed both properties, their estimated values based on an informal appraisal he'd apparently commissioned, the outstanding mortgage balance on neither of them, because there was none, my pension income, my estimated net worth. Below that was a column labeled Post-Marriage Accessible Assets. She'd closed the laptop and hadn't said anything. She'd spent 2 months trying to decide what she was seeing, whether it was what it looked like, whether a man who was genuinely good could also be doing something genuinely calculated. She'd decided to marry him anyway, she told me, because she still wasn't certain. Because she loved him, or thought she did, and because she was afraid that if she pulled on the thread, the whole thing would unravel and she might be wrong, and she would have destroyed something real over a spreadsheet. But she'd put the note in my pocket because she needed someone else to know. She needed me not to sign anything. I didn't tell her about the land registry inquiry. Not yet. I asked her to give me a week. What followed was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no shouted accusations in a doorway. What I did was methodical, because that's what I know how to do. I had Teresa contact the Law Society of Ontario to run a check on a notary whose name had appeared in the correspondence associated with the land registry inquiry. What came back was not what I expected, and somehow exactly what I expected. The notary, a man operating out of a small office in Gatineau, had 2 prior complaints filed against him by clients alleging unauthorized document preparation. Both complaints had been settled quietly. Neither had resulted in formal discipline. He was, in other words, a man with a history of going right up to the edge of something without going over it. I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds. I'm a 64-year-old retired engineer who had never in my life hired a private investigator. And I sat in a coffee shop near Elgin Street and spoke to a woman named, I won't use her real name, and told her what I needed, which was documentation of any existing relationship between Tristan and that notary, and whether there was any prior instance of Tristan having been involved in a property dispute, estate matter, or fraud allegation. She came back to me in 10 days. There had been a woman in Montreal before Isabel, a relationship that had lasted 8 months and ended when the woman, a recently widowed owner of a small commercial property in NDG, had discovered that Tristan had begun the process of registering a spousal-style interest in her property under Quebec civil law, which has provisions that can be exploited if a partner is named in certain financial instruments before they were even engaged. She had not pursued legal action. She had simply ended the relationship, and according to the investigator's source, had been advised by her own lawyer to document everything and keep quiet. She had kept quiet. I had 10 days' worth of documentation. I had Teresa's records of the land registry inquiry. I had the investigator's file on the Montreal situation. I had a copy of the Law Society complaints against the notary, and I had Isabel's photograph of the spreadsheet, which she had taken on her phone in August and never deleted. I called a family lawyer, not Teresa, a different one, someone who specialized specifically in matrimonial property law. We met on a Tuesday morning in a boardroom on Spark Street. I laid everything on the table. I said I needed to know what my exposure was, and my daughter's exposure, and what the most effective way to close those doors permanently would be. She told me clearly what Tristan had likely been constructing, a position in which, following the marriage, he would be cohabitating with Isabel in a house I owned, which under Ontario's Family Law Act creates certain protections and interests that can complicate ownership if not properly documented in advance. He had also been positioning to be added to the Calabogie title, which would have given him a registered ownership interest that would survive a separation. The wealth management framing of his work was not incidental. It was the expertise that had made him very good at identifying exactly where the gaps were. The family lawyer helped me prepare what she called a comprehensive protective documentation package, a spousal property agreement that Isabel would need to have Tristan sign, confirming that neither property was matrimonial property, subject to equalization, prepared in a way that would be very difficult for a wealth management professional to claim he hadn't understood. She also prepared a formal letter to the notary in Gatineau, CC'd to the Law Society, advising him that any further activity connected to my name or my daughter's name would be treated as unauthorized practice and referred immediately for disciplinary review. The question was how to present it to Tristan. Isabel decided that part. She told me she wanted to do it herself. She said she needed to see his face when she put the document in front of him. She said she needed to know, finally, what she was actually dealing with. They sat down together on a Thursday evening, 10 days after the wedding. She told me what happened afterward. He had been quiet for a long time, looking at the documentation summary she'd placed on the table. Not the full file, just a brief outlined version that made clear how much she knew, and when she'd known it. He had not denied it immediately. He had said it wasn't what it looked like. He had said he was thinking about their future together, about protecting assets for their eventual children, that the inquiry had been preliminary, exploratory, that he'd been going to discuss it with her. She had asked him why there was a spreadsheet labeled Post-Marriage Accessible Assets on his personal laptop from 18 months before their wedding. He didn't have an answer for that. He moved out the following weekend. The marriage was 3 weeks old. The separation paperwork, prepared by the family lawyer, protected both properties completely. The notary in Gatineau received the letter. The Law Society opened a file. Tristan's firm let him go 2 months later. I don't know the details of that and didn't ask for them. What I know is this. On the morning Isabel came back to the house in Manotick and sat at the kitchen table and ate breakfast with Doris and me, for the first time in weeks, she looked exhausted and lighter at the same time. The way a person looks when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally set it down in the right place. She didn't say much. She ate her eggs. She looked out the window at the backyard, where the last of the October leaves were still on the maples, holding on past when they should have fallen, bright orange against a sky going white with the first cold of the season. She asked if we could go up to the cabin at Calabogie that weekend. I said yes. The drive up takes about an hour and a half from Manotick. We went on the Saturday, Isabel, Doris, and me, and we took the old highway rather than the bypass because the colors are better that way. My father built that cabin without a contractor, using plans he'd drawn himself in 2 summers of weekends. He wasn't an engineer. He was a high school geography teacher who believed that a man should know how to build a shelter for his family with his own hands. The cabin still stands exactly as he left it, which says something about how he built things. We spent 2 days up there. Isabel and I went out on the water in the old aluminum canoe Saturday morning, just the two of us, the way we used to when she was small. Neither of us said very much. The lake was flat and cold, and the tree line was more orange than green, and the air smelled exactly like October, in the Ottawa Valley, is supposed to smell, like wood smoke and cold water, and the particular clarity you only get when the leaves have done most of their falling. At one point she asked me if I'd known something was wrong from the beginning. I said I'd had a feeling I didn't know what to do with. She said she thought she'd known too, somewhere, but hadn't wanted to see it because she was afraid of what it meant. She said she felt foolish. I told her that she wasn't foolish. I told her that one of the most difficult things about genuine care for another person is that it temporarily compromises your ability to read them clearly. I told her that the courage she'd shown in putting that note in my pocket, not panicking, not accusing, just creating a quiet signal to someone she trusted, was exactly right. That she'd done it at the hardest possible moment, in the middle of her own wedding, and she'd kept her head. She was quiet for a while, her paddle resting across the gunwales. Then she said, "He picked the wrong family to try that with." I said, "Yes, he did." We paddled back in. Doris had coffee waiting, and a fire in the wood stove my father had installed in 1974, the same wood stove that has been in that cabin ever since. Solid and unchanged, and exactly where it's supposed to be. Some things are built to last. The people who try to take them apart usually aren't.